High in the Colorado Rockies, where cell service dies and civilization feels like a distant memory, Marcus Reed stared at the rotting wooden structure he'd just bought sight unseen. The real estate agent had called it a fixer-upper with potential. What stood before him looked more like kindling waiting for a match. But Marcus didn't buy this place for its curb appeal. The former Navy SEAL needed somewhere to disappear, somewhere his nightmares couldn't follow him from 3 tours overseas. His hands, steady enough to disarm bombs in Kandahar, now shook from memories he couldn't shake. As he stepped through the broken doorframe, something crunched under his boot. Not just debris, fresh footprints in the dust. Someone had been here recently. His military instincts flared as he noticed scratches around the floorboards, like someone had been digging. Then he found the letter nailed to the back wall. Some secrets should stay buried. Leave now or join them. Who wanted him gone? And what were they so desperate to hide beneath this forgotten mountain cabin? Marcus pulled the rusted nail free and examined the paper. The handwriting was feminine, deliberate, with the kind of pressure that suggested urgency rather than anger. The paper itself felt expensive, too refined for a threatening note left in an abandoned cabin. His trained eye catalogued every detail, no watermarks, blue ink from what looked like a fountain pen, and a faint scent of lavender that seemed impossibly fresh. The wind whistled through gaps in the cabin walls, carrying the crisp bite of early autumn. Snow would come soon to these peaks, probably within the month. Whatever renovations he planned would need to happen fast, or he'd be spending winter in his truck. He crumpled the note and shoved it into his jacket pocket, then began a systematic sweep of the cabin's interior. The main room was roughly 20 by 15 feet, with a stone fireplace that had partially collapsed on one side. Water damage had warped most of the floorboards, and daylight streamed through missing roof shingles. But the bones were solid, thick log construction that could weather another century if properly maintained. The kitchen consisted of a rust-stained sink and a wood-burning stove that looked older than his grandfather. No electricity, no running water, no modern conveniences. Perfect. The fewer connections to the outside world, the better. In what might have once been a bedroom, Marcus found more evidence of recent activity. Someone had moved the debris into neat piles, as if searching methodically through the wreckage. Fresh scratches marked the wooden floor in several spots, concentrated near the far wall where the foundation met the logs. His phone buzzed, a miracle of reception this high up. A text from his sister. "How's the new place? Send pictures." Marcus almost laughed. What would he photograph? The gaping holes? The threatening note? The mystery of whoever wanted him gone badly enough to leave warnings? Instead, he powered off the phone and tucked it away. Sarah meant well, but she couldn't understand why he'd left everything behind in Virginia. How could she? She hadn't been there when Rodriguez died, hadn't felt the kid's blood soaking through desert sand while Marcus tried desperately to stop the bleeding. Outside, his pickup truck sat loaded with basic supplies, tools, canned food, a sleeping bag, and enough ammunition to hold off a small army. Old habits died hard, especially when someone was already threatening him before he'd even unpacked. The sun hung low over the western peaks, painting the aspens in shades of gold that reminded him why he'd chosen Colorado. Beauty, this raw and untamed, demanded respect, not conquest. Maybe here, surrounded by something larger than human conflict, he could finally find peace. A branch snapped somewhere in the trees beyond the cabin. Marcus froze, every nerve suddenly alert. In the silence that followed, he heard nothing but wind and his own heartbeat. Still, instinct told him he wasn't alone on this mountain. He'd purchased the property through an estate sale, bought it from the heirs of someone named Eleanor Whitman, who'd died 3 months ago. The paperwork had been straightforward, the price almost suspiciously low for 40 acres of pristine mountain land. Now he wondered what the previous owner had known, what secrets might have died with her. Another sound, definitely footsteps this time, careful and measured. Marcus moved to the window, staying low as he peered through a gap in the boards. The forest seemed empty, but someone was out there watching. He could feel eyes on him, the way he'd felt sniper scopes in Afghanistan. The smart move would be to leave, drive back down the mountain road and forget about this place. But Marcus Reed had spent too many years running, from memories, from nightmares, from the weight of decisions that had kept his unit alive while others died. This crumbling cabin represented his last chance at something resembling normal life. Whatever secrets lay buried here, whoever wanted him gone, they'd have to do better than anonymous threats. He'd faced down Taliban fighters and survived 3 IED explosions. A mountain mystery and some footprints in the dirt weren't enough to scare him away. At least, that's what he told himself as darkness fell and the watching presence in the trees grew stronger. The morning sun cast long shadows through the broken windows as Marcus stood in what had once been the cabin's main room. 3 weeks had passed since he'd signed the papers, and the place looked even worse in daylight than it had during his initial visit. Water stains bloomed across the ceiling like dark flowers, and the floorboards sagged ominously in the corner where rot had taken hold. Marcus pulled on his work gloves and hefted the sledgehammer. The interior walls would have to come down first. Most of them weren't load-bearing anyway, just cheap partitions that had been added sometime in the 70s. He'd checked the original blueprints at the county office. The cabin had been built in 1952 by a man named William Thorne, constructed as a simple 2-room structure before subsequent owners had chopped it up into a maze of cramped spaces. The first swing felt good. The drywall crumbled like old bone, revealing the wooden frame beneath. Another swing, then another. Each impact sent vibrations up his arms, a physical rhythm that began to drown out the familiar whispers in his head. The voices of men he couldn't save, the sound of helicopters that would never stop circling in his memory. By midday, he'd cleared most of the eastern wall. Dust motes danced in the shafts of sunlight, and sweat had soaked through his shirt despite the mountain chill. He was reaching for his water bottle when he heard it, the crunch of gravel under tires. Marcus froze. No one knew he was here. He'd specifically chosen this place for its remoteness, bought it through a lawyer to keep his name off any easily accessible records. The road leading up to the cabin was barely more than a deer trail, overgrown and unmarked. He moved to the window and peered through a gap in the plywood he'd nailed up for temporary privacy. A dark SUV was making its way up the winding drive, moving slowly over the rutted ground. The windows were tinted, making it impossible to see who was inside. The SUV stopped about 30 yards from the cabin. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the driver's door opened, and a woman stepped out. She was tall and lean, probably in her early 30s, with auburn hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. She wore hiking boots, dark jeans, and a forest green jacket that looked expensive but functional. What struck Marcus most was the way she moved, alert, careful, scanning the area with the practiced eye of someone who'd been trained to notice threats. "Mr. Reed," her voice carried clearly across the clearing, "I'd like to speak with you." Marcus stepped onto the sagging front porch, keeping his hands visible but ready. "You've got the advantage, ma'am. You know my name, but I don't know yours." She took a few steps closer, stopping when she was still well outside what most people would consider conversational distance. "Professional caution," Marcus noted. "This wasn't some lost hiker or curious neighbor. My name is Sarah Chen," she said. "I work for the Department of Natural Resources. I understand you recently purchased this property." "That's right. All legal and above board, if that's what you're wondering." A slight smile crossed her face, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I'm sure it is. The thing is, Mr. Reed, this land has a complicated history. There are some things about it you should know before you get too settled in." "Such as?" Sarah glanced around the clearing, her gaze lingering on the tree line, as if she expected something to emerge from the shadows. "Are you familiar with the previous owner? A man named Vincent Carrera?" Marcus kept his expression neutral, but the name meant nothing to him. The paperwork had listed the property as being sold by a bank after foreclosure. "Can't say that I am. Mr. Carrera disappeared 6 months ago. His body was never found." She paused, letting that sink in. "The local sheriff's department has closed the case, But there are federal agencies that maintain an active interest in this area. And you're here because? Because whatever happened to Vincent Carrera, it's connected to this land. And if you're planning to stay here to dig around and renovate, you might uncover things that certain people would prefer remained buried. The wind picked up, rustling through the pine trees with a sound like whispered warnings. Marcus studied Sarah's face, looking for tells, for any sign of deception. What he saw instead was genuine concern mixed with something else, fear, maybe, or anticipation. "Miss Chen," he said finally, "I came here to be left alone. I understand that. But alone might not be an option anymore." The rhythmic swing of the hammer against rotting boards had become Marcus's meditation. 3 days of 16-hour work sessions had cleared most of the debris from the cabin's interior, revealing the solid bone structure beneath decades of neglect. His shoulders ached, his hands were raw despite the work gloves, and every muscle in his body screamed protest, but for the first time in months his mind felt quiet. The morning sun streamed through the gaping holes where windows should be, casting geometric patterns across the rough-hewn floor. Marcus paused to wipe sweat from his forehead, surveying his progress. The main room was nearly gutted now, ready for the real work to begin. He'd found hand-carved support beams that would have cost a fortune to replicate, and the stone fireplace, once cleaned, revealed intricate masonry that spoke of craftsmen who took pride in their work. A sound from outside made him freeze, footsteps on gravel, deliberate and approaching fast. Marcus set down his hammer and moved to the window frame, staying in the shadows. His body automatically shifted into alert mode, muscles coiled, breathing controlled. Old habits died hard. A woman emerged from the tree line, moving with purposeful strides up the overgrown path to his cabin. She was younger than he'd initially thought from her confident gait, maybe early 30s, with dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. Her hiking boots and cargo pants suggested she was comfortable in the wilderness, but there was something about the way she moved that set off his internal alarms. She stopped 20 feet from the cabin and called out, "Marcus Reed!" He stepped into the doorway, keeping his hands visible but ready. "Depends who's asking. My name is Sarah Chen. I need to talk to you about this land. It's my land. Bought it fair and square." She moved closer, and he could see her face clearly now. High cheekbones, intelligent dark eyes that seemed to catalogue every detail of his appearance and the cabin behind him. There was an intensity about her that reminded him of mission briefings, when lives hung in the balance of the information being shared. "The previous owner didn't tell you everything," she said, stopping at the bottom of the porch steps, "about what happened here, about why this place sat empty for so long." Marcus crossed his arms. "Lady, I bought a piece of property that needed work. Whatever ghost stories or local legends you're peddling, I'm not interested. This isn't folklore." Her voice carried an edge of urgency. "People have died on this land, Marcus, recently, and if you keep digging around here, you might be next." Something in her tone made him pause. He'd heard that particular combination of fear and determination before, usually from assets who'd stumbled onto something bigger and more dangerous than they'd bargained for. "You have 5 minutes," he said, not moving from the doorway. Sarah glanced around the clearing as if checking for surveillance, then looked back at him. "The man who sold you this property, William Hartley, wasn't the original owner. He inherited it from his brother Daniel, who died in what the sheriff called a hunting accident 18 months ago. Accidents happen in the mountains. Daniel Hartley was an experienced outdoorsman, 30 years of hunting these woods, the kind of man who checks his equipment twice and never takes unnecessary risks." She climbed the first step. He was found with a bullet in his back, Marcus, his own rifle beside him, but the trajectory was all wrong for an accidental discharge. Marcus felt the familiar chill of operational awareness creeping up his spine. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because Daniel wasn't Hartley the first. There were 2 other deaths in the past 5 years, all on or near this property, all ruled accidental, all involving people who were asking questions about the land's history." "What kind of history?" Sarah reached into a jacket, and Marcus tensed automatically. She noticed his reaction and moved slowly, pulling out a folded piece of paper. During World War II, this area was used as a training facility, off the books, the kind of place where they tested things the government didn't want traced back to them. She held out the paper. Chemical weapons, biological agents, experimental interrogation techniques. When the war ended, they supposedly cleaned it all up and abandoned the site. Marcus took the document, recognizing the format of classified government records, even though the text was heavily redacted. Supposedly. The cleanup was incomplete, rushed. There are things buried on this land that powerful people want to stay buried. Sarah's eyes met his. Daniel Hartley found evidence, started asking questions. 3 weeks later, he was dead. The paper felt heavy in Marcus's hands, weighted with implications he was only beginning to understand. His peaceful retreat was evaporating like morning mist, replaced by the familiar sensation of standing at the edge of something dark and dangerous. "What's your connection to all this?" he asked. Sarah's expression hardened. "Daniel Hartley was my partner, and I'm going to prove he was murdered." The woman moved like smoke through the trees, her dark hair catching fragments of morning light as she approached the cabin. Marcus watched from behind the kitchen window, his coffee growing cold in his hands. She wore hiking boots and cargo pants, a tactical knife visible on her belt, but it was the way she scanned the perimeter that made his instincts flare, professional, careful, dangerous. He set down his mug and checked the Glock holstered beneath his flannel shirt. Old habits died hard, especially when strangers appeared at your isolated mountain retreat, carrying themselves like operators. She knocked 3 times, sharp and confident. Marcus waited a beat before opening the door, keeping his weight balanced on the balls of his feet. "Mr. Reed?" Her voice was smooth honey over steel. Up close, he could see she had startling green eyes and a small scar running along her left temple. "My name is Elena Vasquez. I believe we need to talk." "About what?" "About why you bought land that doesn't belong to you." Marcus felt his jaw tighten. "I've got the deed that says otherwise." "Deeds can be forged." She stepped closer, and he caught the faint scent of pine and something else. "Gun oil. May I come in? This isn't a conversation for open ground." Every tactical bone in his body screamed against letting her inside, but curiosity won. He stepped back, watching her move through his space with the same careful assessment he'd used clearing a hostile building. "Nice work on the kitchen," she said, running her fingers along the newly installed countertop. "Though, I have to ask, when you were tearing out that back wall, did you find anything unusual?" The question hit him like a physical blow. The hidden room, the strange marks on the concrete, the feeling that he'd disturbed something better left alone. "Depends on your definition of unusual," he said carefully. Elena turned to face him fully, and he saw something flicker in her expression, relief mixed with apprehension. "There's a room back there, hidden, built sometime in the 1980s by a man named David Chen. He worked for the Department of Energy, officially. Unofficially," she shrugged. "Let's just say his research interests extended beyond renewable energy. And you know this how? Because I've been tracking Chen's work for 3 years. He disappeared in 1987, along with several classified projects and a considerable amount of government property." She moved to the window, peering out at the tree line, the kind of property that makes people very nervous when it goes missing. Marcus studied her profile, noting the tension in her shoulders, the way her hand stayed close to that knife. "You're federal." "Was. NSA, Cyber Division, until I started asking the wrong questions about Chen's disappearance." She turned back to him. "Now I'm what you might call a concerned freelancer." "Concerned about what, exactly?" Instead of answering, Elena walked toward the back of the cabin. Marcus followed, his unease growing as she approached the section of wall he'd been planning to demolish. She pressed her palm against a specific spot, and he heard a soft click. A section of the wall swung inward, revealing the hidden room he'd discovered days earlier. "How did you—" Chen was paranoid, But he was also systematic. There are 17 locations across 3 states, all with the same basic setup. Elena stepped into the hidden space, pulling a small flashlight from her pocket. The question is whether this one still has what he left behind. The beam illuminated concrete walls covered in what Marcus had initially thought were random scratches. Under Elena's light, they resolved into something far more disturbing. Complex diagrams that looked part scientific notation, part occult symbology. Jesus, Marcus breathed. Chen called it Project Lazarus, theoretical research into quantum consciousness transfer. Elena's voice was tight, the kind of theoretical research that allegedly drove 3 graduate students to suicide and caused a lab fire that killed 6 people. Marcus felt the walls of the small room pressing in. And you think whatever he was working on is here? I think Chen hid backup data for all his projects, and I think someone else knows about it. She turned to face him, her green eyes reflecting the flashlight beam. 3 days ago, a black SUV was spotted on the access road to this property. Yesterday, satellite imaging showed heat signatures of at least 4 individuals conducting reconnaissance of this area. The tactical implications hit Marcus immediately. If Elena was right, his peaceful retreat was about to become a battleground. Why are you telling me this? Why not just take whatever you're looking for and disappear? Because Chen's security measures require 2 people to activate, and because, she hesitated, vulnerability flickering across her features, because I've been running alone for 3 years, and I'm tired of looking over my shoulder. Outside, a branch snapped in the forest. Both of them froze, hands moving instinctively toward weapons. How much time do we have? Marcus whispered. Elena's smile was sharp as her blade. If we're lucky, maybe an hour before they realize I found you. The sound of splintering wood echoed through the morning air as Marcus drove the crowbar deeper into the rotted floorboard. 3 days had passed since Elena's cryptic warning, and he'd thrown himself into the renovation with renewed intensity, as if the physical labor could drown out the questions circling his mind like vultures. He'd found no trace of her since that night. No footprints around the cabin, no sign anyone had been watching from the tree line. Part of him wondered if exhaustion and isolation had finally caught up with him, manifesting a beautiful stranger with secrets as dark as his own. The floorboard gave way with a satisfying crack, revealing the stone foundation beneath. Marcus wiped sweat from his forehead and reached for his water bottle, pausing when he noticed something glinting in the gap he'd just created. He knelt closer, fishing out what appeared to be a piece of metal, tarnished green with age. It was a military dog tag, but not from any recent conflict. The stamped letters were barely legible, Kowalski, Thomas J. below that, a service number and what looked like a date from 1952. Marcus turned the tag over in his calloused hands. How had it ended up beneath his floorboards? The cabin's history was murky. The realtor had mentioned it changed hands frequently, something about owners never staying long. He'd assumed it was due to the harsh winters and isolation. A branch snapped outside. Marcus's head jerked toward the window, every muscle tensing as his training kicked in. He moved silently to the wall beside the door, grabbing the Glock he kept within easy reach. The forest was never truly quiet, but this sound was different, deliberate. Through the dusty glass, he caught a glimpse of movement near the shed. Someone in dark clothing, moving with practiced stealth through the trees. Marcus slipped out the back door, using the cabin's bulk to mask his approach. He circled wide, feet finding the quiet spots between fallen leaves that he'd unconsciously mapped during his daily runs. The figure came into view, a man in military-style clothing, crouched beside the shed with what looked like surveillance equipment. Marcus closed the distance in seconds, pressing the Glock's barrel against the stranger's neck. "Real slowly," Marcus said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Hands where I can see them." The man froze, then carefully raised his hands. He was older, maybe 60, with graying hair and the weathered look of someone who'd spent decades outdoors. "Turn around." The stranger complied, revealing sharp blue eyes and a face Marcus didn't recognize. But there was something familiar in the man's bearing, the way he held himself despite being at gunpoint. "You're Reed," the man said. It wasn't a question. "Depends who's asking. Name's Carter. Jim Carter. I was hoping we could talk." Funny way of starting a conversation, lurking around my property with spy gear. Carter's eyes flicked to the device at his feet. Definitely surveillance equipment, though more sophisticated than anything Marcus had expected to see in these mountains. "I know how this looks," Carter said carefully, "but I'm not your enemy. I'm trying to protect you." "From what?" "From making the same mistake the others made." The word sent a chill down Marcus's spine. Elena's warning echoing in his memory. What others? Carter studied him for a long moment, seeming to weigh his options. The previous owners of this place, the ones who disappeared. Marcus kept the gun steady while his mind raced. The realtor said they moved away. The realtor lied. Carter's voice was grim. 7 families in 60 years, Reed, all here less than 2 years before they vanished. No forwarding addresses, no contact with friends or relatives afterward. Just gone. That's impossible. Missing persons cases don't just get ignored. They do when the right people want them ignored. Marcus thought of the dog tag, still warm in his pocket. "Who are you, really?" "Retired Army intelligence. I've been tracking a pattern of disappearances connected to government land acquisitions dating back to the Cold War. This property sits on something valuable enough that people have been willing to kill for it." The pieces began clicking together in Marcus's mind. Elena's fear, the too-good-to-be-true sale price, the isolation that had seemed like a blessing but might actually be strategic. What kind of valuable? Before Carter could answer, the sharp crack of a rifle shot split the morning air. The window of Marcus's cabin exploded inward, glass cascading onto the porch like deadly rain. Both men dropped into combat crouches, the adversarial moment forgotten in the face of immediate danger. Marcus scanned the tree line while Carter grabbed his equipment. "Looks like they found us," Carter muttered. "How many?" Marcus asked. "Unknown. But they're not here to negotiate." Marcus's peaceful retreat had just become a battlefield, and he was caught in the middle of a war he didn't understand. The generator's rumble died with a mechanical wheeze, plunging the cabin into darkness, so complete it felt like being buried alive. Marcus's hand instinctively moved to where his sidearm would have been, muscle memory from 1,000 night ops, but found only empty air. He'd left that life behind, hadn't he? "Stay calm," he called out, though he wasn't sure if he was talking to Elena or himself. The silence that followed was too thick, too deliberate. This wasn't just a power failure. A beam of pale light cut through the darkness as Elena's flashlight clicked on. The narrow cone illuminated her face from below, casting sharp shadows that made her look like a ghost. "They're here," she whispered, and Marcus heard something in her voice he hadn't detected before. Not just fear, but resignation. "Who's here?" He moved toward her, floorboards creaking under his weight. Each step seemed to echo through the cabin like a drumbeat. Before she could answer, the first window exploded. Glass showered the living room as a dark shape burst through, rolling across the floor with practiced precision. Marcus dove sideways, tackling Elena behind the kitchen counter as more windows shattered in rapid succession. The attackers moved like smoke, their black tactical gear making them nearly invisible in the darkness. "How many?" Marcus's training kicked in, his mind automatically cataloguing threats, calculating angles, assessing resources. 3, maybe 4 intruders, all armed, all professional. "I don't know," Elena gasped. Her flashlight had skittered across the floor, casting wild shadows as it spun. "They've been tracking me for weeks." A red laser dot danced across the wall above their heads, followed by the distinctive crack of a suppressed rifle. Splinters exploded from the cabinet door, inches from Marcus's face. "The basement," Elena hissed. "There's another way out." Marcus grabbed her hand, and they crawled across the kitchen floor, staying below the counter level. Behind them, boots crunched on broken glass as the intruders advanced methodically through the cabin. These weren't random criminals. Their movement patterns spoke of military training, coordinated assault tactics. The basement door stood slightly ajar, a rectangle of deeper darkness in an already black world. Marcus pushed Elena toward it, then paused. On the counter above them sat his toolbox, and inside that toolbox was a nail gun, not exactly a combat weapon, but better than nothing. He stretched up, fingers barely reaching the metal handle, when a voice cut through the darkness. "Elena Vasquez, we know you're here." The accent was slight but unmistakable. "Eastern European, maybe Russian. You have something that belongs to us." Marcus's blood went cold. This wasn't about the cabin or the land. This was about Elena and whatever secrets she'd been carrying. He'd walked straight into someone else's war. "I destroyed it," Elena called back, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "The research is gone." A low chuckle echoed through the cabin. "Dr. Vasquez, you and I both know that's impossible. 15 years of work doesn't simply disappear." "Doctor." Marcus looked at Elena with new eyes. In the scattered light from her dropped flashlight, he could see the intelligence there, the weight of knowledge that went far beyond hiking and camping. She wasn't just some random woman who'd stumbled onto his property. She was something much more dangerous. The nail gun felt reassuringly solid in his grip as he helped Elena through the basement door. The wooden steps groaned under their weight, each sound amplified in the confined space. Behind them, the intruders had stopped talking, which somehow felt worse than their threats. The basement was a maze of old support beams and forgotten storage, dusty furniture draped in cobwebs. Elena led him toward the far wall with surprising confidence, as if she'd planned this escape route before. Her hands found a loose board, pulling it aside to reveal a narrow opening that led into darkness. "Where does this go?" Marcus whispered. "Old mining tunnel. Connects to the caves about a quarter-mile down the mountain." She squeezed through the opening, a slim frame barely fitting. "My father used it during the war." More pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. Her father, the original owner. The research the intruders wanted. The way she'd known exactly where to find the tunnel exit. Marcus followed her into the passage, pulling the board back into place behind them. The tunnel was barely wide enough for his shoulders, carved roughly from the mountain stone. Water dripped somewhere in the darkness, and the air tasted of minerals and time. Above them, heavy footsteps crossed the basement floor. A beam of bright light swept back and forth, searching. Marcus held his breath, nail gun ready, though he knew it would be useless if they were discovered here. In this narrow space, they'd be sitting ducks. "Keep moving," Elena breathed in his ear. "Once we reach the caves, I'll explain everything." The footsteps overhead stopped. Marcus could hear muffled voices, frustrated commands in that same foreign accent. They'd lost the trail, at least temporarily. But as he crawled through the mountain's darkness, following a woman whose real identity remained a mystery, Marcus realized his peaceful retreat had become something else entirely. The war he'd tried to leave behind had found him anyway. The storm hit just after midnight, turning the mountain into a howling beast of wind and ice. Marcus jolted awake to the sound of something heavy crashing against the cabin's north wall. Rain hammered the windows like bullets, and somewhere in the darkness, wood splintered. He rolled out of bed, instantly alert, muscle memory from countless missions kicking in. The power had gone out. No surprise there. The cabin's electrical system was as unreliable as everything else about this place. Lightning strobed through the windows, casting twisted shadows across the walls he'd spent weeks repairing. Another crash, this one closer. Marcus grabbed his flashlight and pulled on jeans, moving toward the sound. The wind was strong enough to topple trees, and he had a sick feeling about what he might find outside. A sharp knock at the door made him freeze. Nobody should be out in this weather. Nobody could be out in this weather and survive. He approached the door cautiously, hand instinctively reaching for the pistol he kept in the kitchen drawer. "Marcus!" The voice was barely audible over the storm, but he recognized it. "Elena." He yanked open the door, and she stumbled inside, soaked to the bone and shivering violently. Her dark hair was plastered to her skull, and her lips had taken on a dangerous blue tint. Jesus, what are you doing out there? He slammed the door against the wind and immediately began stripping off her jacket. You could have died. Had to warn you. Her teeth chattered so hard she could barely speak. They're coming. Marcus wrapped her in the heavy wool blanket from his couch, his hands rubbing her arms to generate warmth. Who's coming? Elena, you're hypothermic. We need to get you warm first. She gripped his wrist with surprising strength. No time. I saw their lights on the access road before the storm got bad. They think the weather will cover their approach. A chill ran down Marcus's spine that had nothing to do with the cold air she'd brought in. The same people who killed your grandfather? She nodded, pressing closer to him. Despite everything, despite the danger and the mystery surrounding her, having her in his arms felt right. He could smell the rain in her hair, feel her heart racing against his chest. How many? His mind was already shifting into tactical mode, cataloguing weapons, escape routes, defensive positions. At least 4 vehicles, maybe more. Elena pulled back to look at him, her dark eyes reflecting the flashlight beam. Marcus, there's something else. Something I should have told you before. Lightning cracked overhead, so close the cabin shook. In the brief illumination, Marcus saw her face clearly, the fear there, but also determination, and something that looked like guilt. Tell me now, the reason they want this land. It's not just about the mining rights my grandfather discovered. There's something buried up here. Something from the war. What war? World War II. My grandfather wasn't just a prospector, he helped hide things, important things, things that powerful people would kill for even now. Marcus felt the familiar weight of being pulled into something bigger than himself, something with roots that ran deeper than he'd imagined. What kind of things? Before Elena could answer, the sound of engines cut through the storm. Distant, but getting closer. Marcus killed the flashlight immediately and moved to the window, peering through a gap in the curtains. Damn. He could see lights winding up the mountain road, still a mile away, but advancing steadily. How did you know they were coming? I've been watching them, following them. Elena's voice was steadier now, the warmth returning to her body. Marcus, I haven't been completely honest with you about who I am. He turned from the window, studying her face in the darkness. I figured that much. My real name is Elena Vasquez, but my grandfather, he wasn't just Elena's grandfather. He was working with people who had good reasons to hide things from the wrong hands, and now those wrong hands have found us. The engines were getting closer. Marcus could count at least 3 sets of headlights now, moving in formation, professional, coordinated. How long do we have? 20 minutes, maybe less in this storm. Marcus was already moving, gathering supplies with practiced efficiency. Extra ammunition, first aid kit, emergency rations, the calm that always settled over him before action was taking hold. He paused, looking at her. In the space of a few weeks, she'd become something he hadn't expected to find again: hope. The idea of losing her, of running forever, was unacceptable. Then we don't run. He checked his rifle, the weight familiar and reassuring. We make our stand. The storm raged on, but inside the cabin, 2 people prepared to fight for more than just their lives. The storm hit with a vengeance just after midnight, transforming the peaceful mountain retreat into a battlefield of wind and rain. Marcus jolted awake to the sound of something heavy crashing against the cabin's exterior wall. Lightning illuminated the bedroom in stark white flashes, and through the brief moments of visibility, he could see trees bending at impossible angles. Elena was already sitting up beside him, her dark hair wild from sleep, eyes alert and focused on the windows. "This isn't natural," she said, her voice barely audible over the howling wind. "Storms don't move like this up here." Marcus pulled on his jeans and grabbed a flashlight from the nightstand. "Stay here. I need to check the generator and make sure the roof's holding. Like hell I'm staying here." Elena was already reaching for her clothes. "You don't know these mountains like I do." Another crash echoed from outside, followed by the unmistakable sound of splintering wood. Marcus's blood ran cold as he realized it was coming from the direction of his workshop. 3 weeks of renovation work, potentially destroyed in minutes. They made their way through the cabin together, flashlight beams dancing across walls that seemed to pulse with each thunderclap. The living room felt different in the storm's chaos, smaller, more vulnerable. Rain was seeping through a window frame Marcus thought he'd sealed properly, forming dark stains on the wooden floor he'd spent days refinishing. "The generator's out back," Marcus shouted over the wind as they reached the rear door. "If we lose power completely—" Elena grabbed his arm, her grip surprisingly strong. "Wait, listen." Marcus strained his ears beyond the storm's fury. There, beneath the wind and rain, was another sound. Mechanical, deliberate. The low rumble of an engine struggling against the mountain terrain. "Someone's coming up the access road," Elena whispered, and Marcus caught something in her tone he hadn't heard before. Fear. Real, bone-deep fear. In this weather, that's suicide. Not if you're desperate enough. Elena moved to the window, peering through the rain-streaked glass. "Marcus, there are things about my family I haven't told you. Things about why I really came here." The engine's sound grew louder, accompanied now by the crunch of tires on gravel and the scrape of metal against rock. Whoever was driving was pushing their vehicle beyond safe limits, and Marcus's military instincts kicked into high gear. In his experience, people only took those kinds of risks when they were running from something, or running toward something they wanted badly enough to die for. "Talk to me, Elena, right now." She turned from the window, and in the flashlight's glow, her face looked years older than it had that morning. "My grandfather didn't just hide gold up here, he hid evidence. Documents that could destroy some very powerful people, people who've spent decades believing those papers were lost forever." The vehicle's headlights swept across the cabin's front windows, casting moving shadows that made the room feel like it was spinning. Marcus heard doors slamming, voices shouting orders over the storm. Multiple people, organized, professional. "How many?" Elena asked, and Marcus realized she was looking at him with the expectation of someone accustomed to tactical situations. This wasn't just the art history professor he'd been falling for. This was someone with her own dangerous past. At least 3 vehicles. Maybe more. Marcus moved away from the windows, pulling Elena with him toward the kitchen. "There's a root cellar behind the pantry. My grandfather used it during—" "I know about the cellar." Elena's interruption stopped him cold. "Marcus, I know about all of it. The original owner of this property was my great-uncle. This cabin—" She gestured around them. "This was supposed to be my inheritance." The front door exploded inward with a crash that rivaled the thunder. Flashlight beams cut through the darkness, accompanied by the shuffle of heavy boots on his newly installed hardwood floors. Marcus felt his peaceful retreat transforming into a combat zone, all the careful renovation work becoming potential cover and concealment. "Elena Vasquez," a voice called from the front room, calm and professional despite the storm raging outside. "We know you're here. We know what you're looking for. This can end peacefully if you're reasonable." Elena pressed herself against the kitchen wall, her breathing shallow and controlled. She looked at Marcus with eyes that held an apology and a warning in equal measure. "The documents my grandfather hid aren't just evidence of old crimes. They're proof of new ones, ongoing ones, and the people looking for them aren't going to let either of us walk away from this mountain." Marcus felt the familiar weight of his service weapon in his hand, though he couldn't remember drawing it. Outside, the storm continued its assault on the mountain, but inside the cabin, a different kind of tempest was brewing. His quiet retreat had become ground zero for something much larger and more dangerous than he'd ever imagined. The storm hit without warning, transforming the mountain from Marcus's sanctuary into something far more sinister. Rain lashed against the cabin windows with violent intensity, while wind howled through the pines like tortured souls. Inside, the generator hummed steadily, casting warm light across the main room where Marcus paced like a caged wolf. Elena sat curled in the leather chair by the fireplace, her dark hair catching the amber glow of the flames. She'd been quiet since their conversation about the land's history, but Marcus could feel the tension radiating from her small frame. Every few minutes, she'd glance toward the windows, as if expecting something to emerge from the darkness. "You're making me nervous," she said finally, watching him wear a path in the wooden floor. "Sit down." Marcus stopped mid-stride. "Something's wrong. I can feel it. It's just a storm." "No." He moved to the window, peering out into the tempest. "This feels different, like we're being watched." Elena's breath caught, and she joined him at the window. The rain had turned the world into a blur of shadows and movement, making it impossible to distinguish between swaying branches and potential threats. Then lightning split the sky, illuminating the forest for a brief, stark moment. That's when they saw them. 3 figures stood at the tree line, barely visible in their dark clothing, unmoving despite the raging storm. They weren't seeking shelter or trying to get closer to the cabin. They were simply watching. "Backwoodsmen," Elena whispered, her voice barely audible over the thunder. Marcus was already moving, his military training kicking in automatically. He pulled Elena away from the window and killed the lights. "How many exits does this place have?" "Front door, back door through the kitchen, and the cellar entrance on the south side." "Weapons?" "My rifle's upstairs." "You?" Marcus retrieved his Glock from the side table drawer. "This and whatever we can improvise." He checked the magazine, his movements efficient and practiced. They're not going to wait for the storm to pass. Weather like this provides perfect cover. As if summoned by his words, the sound of breaking glass echoed from the kitchen. Marcus grabbed Elena's hand and pulled her toward the stairs. "Upstairs. Get your rifle and barricade yourself in the bedroom. I'm not leaving you alone down here." "This isn't a discussion." His voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed in life-or-death situations. "Get the rifle and cover the stairs from above. Can you do that?" Elena nodded, her fear replaced by grim determination. She disappeared up the stairs while Marcus positioned himself behind the kitchen doorway. The intruder was being careful, moving slowly through the broken glass. Amateur mistake. Patience wasn't always a virtue when entering hostile territory. Marcus waited until he heard the soft creak of floorboards, then struck. He came around the corner fast and low, catching the man off guard. A brief struggle ensued, ending when Marcus applied a chokehold that sent the intruder into unconsciousness. One down. The front door exploded inward, just as Elena's rifle cracked from upstairs. Wood splintered as 2 more men rushed inside, moving with the coordination of professional soldiers. These weren't local thugs. Blackwood had sent experienced operators. Marcus dove behind the couch as automatic weapons fire chewed up the furniture around him. Stuffing and wood chips filled the air like snow. He could hear Elena repositioning upstairs, her rifle providing covering fire that kept the intruders from advancing. "Reed," one of them shouted over the gunfire. "We just want the woman. Send her down and we'll leave." Marcus answered with 3 quick shots that sent both men scrambling for cover. Like hell they'd leave anyone alive after this. He'd seen enough Black Ops to know how these things ended. The lights went out suddenly. They'd cut the generator. Emergency lighting kicked in, bathing everything in an eerie red glow that turned the cabin into something from a nightmare. The storm continued its assault on the roof and walls, creating a symphony of chaos that masked movement and made communication nearly impossible. Elena appeared at the top of the stairs, her rifle trained on the main room. In the crimson light, she looked like an avenging angel, beautiful and deadly. Marcus felt something shift inside his chest, not just attraction, but something deeper. The protective instinct that had driven him through countless missions was now focused entirely on keeping her safe. One of the intruders made a break for the stairs. Elena's shot took him center mass, dropping him before he'd climbed 3 steps. The remaining man cursed and unleashed a spray of bullets that forced her back into cover. Marcus used the distraction to flank left, moving through the kitchen and around to the dining area. The remaining intruder had his back turned, focused on Elena's position upstairs. It was the last mistake he'd ever make. The cabin fell silent, Except for the storm's continued rage outside, Marcus and Elena remained in position for several long minutes, waiting to see if more men would appear from the darkness. Marcus nodded, moving away from the window. The timing couldn't be worse. They'd been planning to hike down to the sheriff's office in the morning with the documents Elena had uncovered about the mining operation. Now they were trapped, isolated, and vulnerable. The radio crackled to life as Elena adjusted the antenna. Through the static came reports of downed power lines, blocked roads, and emergency shelters opening in the valley towns. But what made Marcus's blood run cold was the mention of a prison transport that had skidded off Highway 7, just 15 miles away. 3 inmates unaccounted for, the broadcaster's voice wavered through the interference. Considered extremely dangerous, residents in the mountain areas should secure their homes and report any suspicious activity. Elena's eyes met his across the candlelit room. This can't be a coincidence. Before Marcus could respond, something heavy slammed against the cabin's rear wall. Both of them froze, listening. The wind could explain it, a fallen branch, loose siding. But Marcus's instincts, honed by years of combat, screamed otherwise. Another impact, this time against the front door. Deliberate, methodical. Marcus positioned himself behind the kitchen counter, rifle ready, while Elena crouched near the stone fireplace. The documents they'd discovered were spread across the coffee table, evidence of illegal mining, toxic waste, and corporate cover-ups that someone had already killed to protect. The front door exploded inward. 3 figures burst through, their prison-orange jumpsuits torn and muddy. The first man was massive, with crude tattoos covering his shaved head. The second looked wiry and dangerous, clutching a knife clearly taken from somewhere else. The third hung back, smaller but with predatory eyes that swept the cabin's interior. "Well, well," the big one growled, stepping over the splintered door. "Looks like we found ourselves some hospitality." Marcus didn't hesitate. His first shot took the knife wielder in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending the blade clattering across the floor. The man screamed, clutching his wound as blood seeped between his fingers. The massive inmate dove behind the couch, while the third scrambled toward the kitchen. Marcus tracked his movement, but Elena was closer. She grabbed the cast-iron skillet from the stove and swung it with devastating accuracy. The metal connected with the man's skull with a sickening crack, dropping him instantly. "Behind you!" Elena shouted. Marcus spun as the wounded man lunged for the fallen knife. Another shot echoed through the cabin, and the inmate crumpled. But the big one was moving, using the furniture as cover, working his way toward Elena's position. Years of tactical training kicked in. Marcus vaulted over the counter, using his momentum to tackle the massive convict before he could reach her. They crashed into the wall, sending tools and supplies flying. The man was strong, prison yard strong, but Marcus had advantages the other man couldn't match. He drove his knee upward, finding the soft spot just below the rib cage. The grip loosened enough for Marcus to break free, gasping. His elbow found the man's temple once, twice, until the convict's eyes rolled back and he went limp. The cabin fell silent, except for the storm's continued fury and their ragged breathing. "You okay?" Marcus asked, checking the pulses of the 3 intruders. 2 unconscious, 1 who wouldn't be getting up again. She nodded, lowering the makeshift weapon. "Think this was random?" Marcus surveyed the destroyed front door, the scattered documents, the violence that had invaded their sanctuary. "Nothing's been random since you showed up, Elena. Question is, who sent them?" Outside, the storm raged on, but inside the cabin, surrounded by evidence of corruption and fresh blood on his hands, Marcus realized their fight was just beginning. The storm hit harder than Marcus had anticipated. Rain lashed against the cabin's newly repaired windows, while wind howled through the mountains like a wounded animal. Inside, the fire crackled in the stone hearth he'd rebuilt just weeks ago, casting dancing shadows across the walls where Elena sat cross-legged on the floor, ancient maps spread before her like tarot cards predicting doom. "The mine entrance should be here," she said, pointing to a spot on the yellowed paper where topographical lines converged into tight spirals. But the terrain has changed since 1952. Rock slides, erosion, deliberate concealment. Marcus studied her profile in the firelight. 3 days had passed since her revelation about the uranium mine, 3 days of poring over documents and maps while they waited for the weather to break. She'd told him everything. How her grandfather had been part of a classified mining operation, how the government had abandoned the site when something went wrong, how the land had been sold off quietly to private buyers who never knew what lay beneath their feet. "You said people died," Marcus said, settling beside her with 2 steaming mugs of coffee. "What kind of accident?" Elena's fingers traced the edge of an old photograph showing men in hard hats standing beside industrial equipment. "Cave-in, according to the official report. But my grandfather's journal tells a different story. The miners had been getting sick for weeks, radiation poisoning, though they didn't understand it then. When the tunnel collapsed, it wasn't an accident. It was sabotage. Someone brought the mine down on purpose. My grandfather believed one of the miners did it. A man named Thomas Crane, who'd lost his brother to the radiation sickness. He stayed behind to seal the tunnel, knowing he wouldn't make it out." Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the storm. The name sounded familiar, tugging at memories he couldn't quite grasp. "The previous owner of this cabin. Do you know his name?" Elena looked up sharply. "Why? Just answer the question." She rifled through a stack of papers until she found the deed transfer documents. Robert Crane. The property stayed in the Crane family until... She stopped, understanding dawning in her eyes. Thomas Crane's descendant. The pieces clicked into place like rounds sliding into a magazine. Marcus stood abruptly, pacing to the window where rain streaked down the glass in rivulets. "That's why he sold to me. Below market value, no questions asked, cash only. He knew what was down there. Now the mining company has found out. They're not just after the uranium, Marcus. They're after a cover-up that's been festering for 70 years. If they can extract what's down there and clean up the site, they can bury the truth forever." A flash of lightning illuminated the valley below, and for a moment, Marcus thought he saw vehicle lights winding up the mountain road. But when the darkness returned, there was nothing but rain and wind. "We need to get to that mine," he said. "In this weather? It's suicide." "No, staying here is suicide. Those men who came before, they were scouts. The storm's been keeping the main force away, but it won't last forever." He moved to the gun safe he'd installed behind a false panel, withdrawing his service pistol and checking the magazine. "You said your grandfather's journal had details about the mine's location." Elena nodded reluctantly. "Detailed enough. But Marcus, even if we find it, what then? We can't stop a mining operation with just the 2 of us. We document everything, photos, video, evidence that can't be buried or bought off." He pulled on his tactical vest, muscle memory from countless missions taking over. "And we make sure the truth gets out before they can silence it." She watched him prepare with something between admiration and terror. "You don't have to do this. This isn't your fight." Marcus paused in loading extra magazines into his vest. "You're wrong. The moment I bought this land, it became my fight. The moment you trusted me with the truth, it became my responsibility." He met her eyes across the flickering firelight. "And somewhere along the way, keeping you safe became more important than my own life." The admission hung between them like a bridge neither had expected to cross. Elena rose slowly, moved to where he stood, and placed her hand against his chest where his heart hammered beneath Kevlar and determination. "Then we do this together," she said. Outside, the storm raged on, but Marcus felt something settling inside him that had been restless for years. Purpose, direction, something worth fighting for, that had nothing to do with orders or duty or the ghosts that had driven him to this mountain in the first place. He kissed her then, soft and fierce and desperate, tasting rain and coffee and the copper tang of fear. When they broke apart, her eyes held the same resolve he felt burning in his chest. Together, he agreed. The morning brought an unsettling quiet to the cabin. Marcus stood at the kitchen window, watching the tree line through narrowed eyes while coffee brewed behind him. The silence felt heavy, pregnant with expectation, like the moment before an ambush. His instincts, honed by years of combat, screamed that something was wrong. Elena emerged from the bedroom, her hair tousled from sleep, but her eyes were alert. She'd felt it too, the shift in the air, the sense that their brief respite was over. "They're coming," she said simply, wrapping her arms around herself. Marcus nodded, not turning from the window. "Question is when and how many?" The radio crackled to life from the table where they'd left it. Harrison's voice cut through the static, urgent and commanding. "All units, target acquired. Move to position Charlie. Remember, we need the woman alive, but Reed is expendable." Marcus felt Elena stiffen behind him. The clinical way Harrison discussed his death should have bothered him more than it did. Instead, he felt the familiar calm settling over him, the way it always had before a mission. His mind shifted into tactical mode, calculating angles and distances, cataloging weapons and escape routes. "How well do you know these mountains?" he asked, finally turning to face her. "Better than they do." Elena moved to the window beside him, scanning the forest with practiced eyes. "There's an old mining trail about half a mile north. It leads to a network of caves that most people don't know about. Most people. My grandfather used to take me there when I was young." Before, she trailed off, but Marcus didn't press. There would be time for her secrets later, assuming they both survived the next few hours. A flash of movement caught his eye, sunlight glinting off metal deep in the trees. Marcus grabbed Elena's hand, pulling her away from the window. "They're here." The first shot shattered the kitchen window, spraying glass across the floor where they'd been standing moments before. Marcus was already moving, his body responding with muscle memory as he dragged Elena toward the back of the cabin. More shots followed, systematic and precise, designed to pin them down rather than kill. "The bedroom," Elena gasped, pointing toward the rear of the cabin. "There's a window that faces the ravine." Marcus kicked open the bedroom door, scanning quickly before ushering Elena inside. The window was small but adequate. Below, the ground dropped away sharply into a rocky ravine thick with pine trees. It would be a hell of a jump, but it beat staying trapped. "Can you make it?" he asked, already knowing the answer from the determined set of her jaw. "Just go." Marcus knocked out the remaining glass with the butt of his rifle, then swung his legs over the sill. The drop was farther than he'd hoped. At least 15 feet to the rocky slope below, he landed hard, his ankles screaming in protest, but managed to stay upright. Elena followed without hesitation, trusting him to catch her. He did, absorbing most of her impact and sending them both tumbling down the loose scree. Behind them, voices shouted as Harrison's men reached the cabin. They scrambled through the underbrush, Elena leading now, her knowledge of the terrain their only advantage. The forest was thick enough to provide cover, but Marcus could hear their pursuers crashing through the trees behind them, making no attempt at stealth now that the hunt had begun. Elena led him up a steep ridge, her breathing labored but steady. At the top, she paused, getting her bearings, then pointed toward a cluster of weathered rocks that looked like natural formations, but weren't quite random enough. "There," she whispered. The cave entrance was cleverly concealed, little more than a crack between two massive boulders. Elena squeezed through first, and Marcus followed, grateful for his recent weight loss. The passage opened into a larger chamber, lit by thin shafts of sunlight filtering through cracks in the rock above. Ancient mining equipment lay scattered about, rusty picks, broken lanterns, rotted wooden supports, but it was the back wall that made Marcus stop and stare. Symbols were carved deep into the rock, similar to the ones they'd found at the installation, but older, more primitive. "This is where it started," Elena said quietly, running her fingers over the carved stone. "Where my great-grandfather first found traces of the mineral. He thought he was going to make his fortune. What happened? He died, along with most of his crew. The official report said it was a cave-in, but the survivors told different stories. Stories about the rocks themselves seeming to pulse with life, about men going mad from exposure to the dust. Outside, voices echoed off the rocks as their pursuers spread out, searching. Marcus moved to the cave entrance, listening. They had bought themselves time, but not much. Harrison wouldn't give up easily, and eventually someone would find their trail. He turned back to Elena, seeing her clearly in the dim light. Not just the mysterious woman who had appeared at his cabin, but someone carrying the weight of generations of secrets. "Tell me everything," he said, "all of it, because we're running out of places to hide." The storm that had been threatening all evening finally broke just as Marcus finished barricading the last window. Rain hammered against the reinforced glass like bullets, and the wind howled through the trees with a violence that made the cabin's frame groan in protest. Elena stood by the fireplace, her face illuminated by the dancing flames, but her eyes were fixed on the darkness beyond the windows. "They'll come tonight," she said, her voice barely audible above the storm. Thomas always preferred to move in bad weather. Less chance of witnesses, harder to track. Marcus checked his rifle one more time, the familiar weight of the weapon both comforting and terrible in his hands. How many times had he prepared for battle like this? How many nights had he spent waiting for death to come calling? He'd thought those days were behind him. "Tell me about the mine," he said, settling into position near the front door. "If we need an escape route." Elena wrapped her arms around herself, though the cabin was warm. "There are 3 main tunnels. The eastern shaft leads deeper into the mountain. It's a dead end, but there are some natural caves that connect to it. The western tunnel comes out near the old logging road, about 2 miles down the mountain. And the third? Collapsed years ago. That's where—" She trailed off, but Marcus could fill in the blanks, where the bodies were buried, where her father's sins were literally underground. A branch crashed against the roof, making them both jump. In that moment of startled vulnerability, Elena's mask slipped, and Marcus saw the terrified girl beneath the tough exterior. Without thinking, he crossed to her and pulled her into his arms. "We're going to get through this," he murmured against her hair. "I promise." She melted against him for just a moment, and he felt something shift between them, something deeper than attraction or shared danger. Then she pulled back, her walls rising again. "You can't promise that," she said. "You don't know what Thomas is capable of." A sound outside made them both freeze. Not the wind or rain, but something else. The crunch of gravel under tires, barely audible through the storm. Marcus moved to the window, peering through a gap in the boards. 3 sets of headlights cut through the darkness, vehicles moving slowly up the mountain road. They killed their lights when they reached the turnoff to his property. "How many men does he usually travel with?" Marcus whispered. 6, maybe 8, all ex-military like him. Elena's voice was tight with fear. "Marcus, there's something else you should know. About why Thomas wants me dead so badly." He turned to look at her, noting the way her hands trembled as she reached into her jacket. She pulled out a small digital recorder, its red recording light blinking steadily. "I've been documenting everything," she said. "Every conversation, every threat, every admission of guilt. 3 months' worth of evidence that could put him away forever." "Jesus, Elena, you've been wearing a wire this whole time?" "Not just with him, with everyone involved in the cover-up. Politicians, police, federal agents. I have enough evidence to bring down the entire network." She pressed the recorder into his hands. "If something happens to me, nothing's going to happen to you." The sound of car doors slamming echoed through the storm. Marcus counted at least 6 distinct sounds, maybe more. Through the rain, he could see dark shapes moving through the trees, spreading out to surround the cabin. "Back door," he whispered urgently. "Now." They moved through the cabin like shadows, Marcus leading with his rifle raised. As they reached the kitchen, the first gunshot shattered the night. The front window exploded inward, sending glass cascading across the floor. Marcus kicked open the back door and they plunged into the storm. The rain was so heavy it was like running through a waterfall, and within seconds they were both soaked to the skin. Behind them, more gunfire erupted as Thomas's men realized their prey had escaped. "The mine," Elena gasped, stumbling over the rough terrain. "This way." They crashed through the undergrowth, branches tearing at their clothes and faces. Marcus could hear shouts behind them, getting closer. His military training kicked in automatically, assess the terrain, identify cover, keep moving. The entrance to the mine yawned before them like a mouth, darker than the storm-lashed night. Elena didn't hesitate, plunging into the blackness. Marcus followed, pulling out his flashlight as they descended into the earth. The tunnel was smaller than he'd expected, the walls rough-hewn and supported by rotting timber beams. Their footsteps echoed strangely in the confined space, and the air smelled of rust and decay. "Which way?" he asked when they reached a junction. Elena pointed left, western tunnel. "But Marcus, if they follow us in—" "They will." He checked his ammunition. "And when they do, we'll be ready." As if summoned by his words, lights appeared at the tunnel entrance behind them. Thomas had found their trail. The storm hit without warning, transforming the mountain into a writhing beast of wind and ice. Marcus pressed his back against the cabin's newly reinforced wall, listening to the howl outside that seemed to carry voices from his nightmares. Elena crouched beside him, her breath visible in the suddenly frigid air. "They're using the weather," she whispered, her fingers tracing symbols on the frosted window. "The circle I disrupted, it's fighting back." Through the glass, Marcus could see shapes moving in the blizzard, too tall and angular to be human. His hand instinctively moved to the Glock at his hip, though he wondered what good bullets would do against whatever haunted this cursed land. "Tell me there's a way to stop this," he said, watching Elena's face pale as she studied the approaching figures. "There is." Her voice carried a weight that made his stomach drop. "But you're not going to like it." Before she could explain, something massive slammed into the cabin's north wall. The impact sent tools flying from Marcus's workbench, and he heard the ominous crack of timber. Another blow followed, then another, each one accompanied by a sound like grinding stone. "The basement," Elena said urgently. "There's something I haven't told you about what's down there." Marcus grabbed his tactical flashlight and the emergency kit he'd assembled from old habits. "Lead the way." They descended into the cabin's foundation, where Marcus's renovation work had exposed the original stone walls. Elena moved with surprising certainty in the darkness, guiding him to a section where the stones bore carved markings he'd assumed were decorative. "Your great-uncle didn't just find this place," she said, running her hands along the symbols. "He was led here, chosen, just like you were. Chosen for what?" But even as Marcus asked, he felt the truth settling in his bones like cold iron. To be the guardian, the seal between what's buried here and the world above. Elena's fingers found a particular stone, pressing it inward. The wall swung open with surprising ease, revealing a chamber beyond. The space was larger than should have been possible, carved from living rock and lit by phosphorescent minerals that cast everything in an eerie blue-green glow. At the center sat a well, its depths so black they seemed to drink the light itself. "This is what they're after," Elena said. "What's been calling to you since you arrived? Your nightmares, the sense of being watched. It's been testing you, measuring your strength." Marcus approached the well cautiously, his SEAL training warring with an inexplicable pull toward the darkness below. "And if I'm not strong enough? Then everything you've built here, everything you've fought to become, it all gets consumed, along with everyone for miles around." Another impact shook the cabin above, and dust rained from the chamber's ceiling. Through the foundation stones, Marcus could hear scratching sounds, as if massive claws were digging through earth and rock. "How do I stop it?" Elena's silence stretched too long. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. "Blood calls to blood. Your uncle's sacrifice weakened the seal but didn't break it. Someone from his bloodline has to renew it. Sacrifice." The word tasted like copper in his mouth. "You mean die?" "Not necessarily." But her eyes wouldn't meet his. "The stories are unclear about whether the Guardian survives the binding." The scratching sounds grew louder, closer. Something was tunneling toward them, drawn by their presence or perhaps by the well itself. Marcus thought of all the renovations he'd made, how each nail and board had felt like stitching his soul back together. He'd come here broken, haunted by the weight of lives lost and missions failed. But in rebuilding this place, he'd begun rebuilding himself. "There has to be another way," he said. Elena finally looked at him, and he saw tears tracking down her cheeks. "I've been searching for one for 3 years, ever since I realized what this place really is, what you'd have to face. I wanted to warn you away, but the pull was too strong. You were always going to end up here." A section of the chamber wall cracked, and something pale and segmented pushed through. A limb that belonged to no earthly creature. The temperature plummeted further, and Marcus could see his breath forming ice crystals in the air. "Then we do this my way," he said, pulling Elena away from the advancing horror. "I didn't survive Kandahar and rebuild this entire cabin just to roll over and die for some mystical nonsense." He studied the chamber with tactical eyes, noting the phosphorescent veins running through the rock, the way they all seemed to converge on the well. The scratching had become a grinding roar, and more cracks appeared in the walls. "The minerals," he said suddenly. "They're not just decoration, they're part of the seal's structure." Elena's eyes widened as she followed his reasoning. "If we could redirect the energy somehow, channel it differently, then maybe we rewrite the rules." Marcus smiled grimly, pulling C4 from his emergency kit. "Time to renovate one more room." The helicopter's rotors cut through the morning air like a mechanical scythe, the sound reverberating off the canyon walls below. Marcus gripped the safety harness, his knuckles white against the olive-drab webbing as he peered down at the forest canopy rushing beneath them. Beside him, Elena sat rigid, her face pale but determined, clutching the GPS coordinates they'd extracted from her father's hidden files. 2 minutes out, the pilot's voice crackled through their headsets. Marcus had called in a favor from his old unit, no questions asked, just like the old days. Some debts never expired. The coordinates led them deep into the wilderness, miles from any marked trail or logging road. As they descended toward a small clearing, Marcus spotted what looked like concrete structures partially hidden beneath decades of overgrowth. His pulse quickened. Whatever Elena's father had been involved with, it was real, and it was big. The helicopter touched down with a jarring thud, kicking up a whirlwind of pine needles and dust. Marcus helped Elena down, both of them ducking instinctively as the rotors spun overhead. "I'll circle back in 4 hours," the pilot shouted over the noise. "Miss that window, and you're hiking out." Marcus gave a thumbs up, and the helicopter lifted off, leaving them in sudden, ringing silence. The forest seemed to close in around them, tall pines swaying in the mountain breeze. But it was the man-made structures ahead that commanded their attention. "Jesus," Elena breathed, staring at what was clearly the entrance to an underground facility. The concrete was weathered and stained, but the heavy steel door looked surprisingly intact. He really did it. He actually built this place. Marcus approached the entrance cautiously, his soldier's instincts on high alert. The door bore no markings, no government seals or corporate logos, just a numeric keypad, its LED display still glowing red after all these years. "Your father's birthday?" he suggested. Elena shook her head. He wouldn't have used something that obvious. She stared at the keypad for a long moment, then began typing. The sequence she entered was longer than Marcus expected, 12 digits that seemed to flow from her memory. The LED turned green, and heavy mechanical locks disengaged with a series of metallic clanks. The door swung inward on well-oiled hinges, revealing a corridor that disappeared into darkness. "What was that code?" Marcus asked. "The date Mom died," Elena said quietly. "He blamed himself for not being there. Said he was too busy with his work." They stepped inside, their flashlight beams cutting through the stale air. The facility was larger than Marcus had imagined, with branching corridors and rooms filled with equipment covered in protective plastic. Emergency lighting flickered to life as motion sensors detected their presence, revealing a space that looked like it had been abandoned yesterday rather than decades ago. "Backup power systems," Marcus noted, impressed despite himself. "Your father didn't cut corners." They found the main laboratory in the facility's heart, a vast room lined with monitoring equipment, computer terminals, and what looked like seismic sensors. Elena moved to one of the workstations, her fingers dancing over controls that seemed familiar despite the years. "It's all here," she said, wonder and horror mixing in her voice. The geological surveys, the mineral analysis, the calculations. She pulled up files on an ancient but functional computer terminal. "Marcus, look at this." The screen displayed a three-dimensional model of the mountain's internal structure. Red zones marked areas of instability, with branching fracture lines that looked like a spider web of potential disaster. At the center of it all was their mountain, and Marcus's cabin. "The mining operation," Elena continued, scrolling through more data. "It wasn't random. They're following specific mineral veins, but they're destabilizing the entire geological structure. If they continue on their current trajectory, the whole mountainside comes down." Marcus finished grimly. "Not just our mountain. The model shows a cascade failure. It could trigger landslides for miles, potentially damming the river below." Elena's face was ashen. Thousands of people could be affected. Marcus studied the data, his mind racing. The precision of the information was staggering. Elena's father hadn't just been a concerned scientist, he'd been a man who'd seen the future and tried desperately to prevent it. "There's more," Elena said, opening another file. This one contained personnel records, financial transactions, and communication logs. The mining company, they knew. Dad tried to warn them, and they offered to buy his silence. When he refused, the final entries in the log were dated just days before Elena's father's car accident. Meetings with corporate executives, increasingly desperate attempts to contact government regulators, and finally, a decision to go public with his findings. Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the underground air. "They killed him." Elena nodded, tears streaming down her face. "And now they're going to finish what they started, unless we stop them." The weight of their discovery settled over them like a shroud. They weren't just fighting for Marcus's cabin anymore. They were fighting for everyone in the valley below. The storm had passed, leaving the mountain air crisp and unnaturally quiet. Marcus stood on the cabin's rebuilt porch, watching steam rise from the wet earth as morning sunlight filtered through the pine canopy. 3 days had elapsed since the confrontation with Graves and his mercenaries, and the silence felt both peaceful and unsettling. Elena emerged from the cabin carrying 2 steaming mugs of coffee, her movements still careful due to the bandages wrapped around her ribs. The bullet graze had been shallow, but it served as a stark reminder of how close they'd come to losing everything. "Sheriff Morrison called," she said, settling beside him on the wooden bench he'd crafted weeks ago. "The last of Graves' men was found hiding in a cave system about 10 miles south. That's all of them accounted for." Marcus accepted the coffee gratefully, inhaling the rich aroma. "What about the mining operation?" "Federal investigators are crawling all over the site. Turns out Blackwater Industries was just a shell company. The real operation runs much deeper, illegal rare earth mining with ties to several defense contractors." Elena's voice carried a mixture of satisfaction and exhaustion. "My grandfather's research was more valuable than even he knew." They sat in comfortable silence, watching a hawk circle lazily overhead. The past few days had been a whirlwind of federal agents, medical examinations, and endless questions. Now, finally, they had a moment to process what had happened. "I've been thinking," Elena said, her fingers tracing the rim of her mug, "about what comes next." Marcus felt his chest tighten. He'd been dreading this conversation, knowing it was inevitable. Elena had a life beyond this mountain, a career, responsibilities, a world that didn't include a broken ex-SEAL and his half-finished cabin. "The university offered me a sabbatical," she continued. "Extended leave to complete my grandfather's research properly, document everything we've discovered here." "That's good," Marcus managed, though the words felt hollow. "Important work." Elena turned to study his profile. "I was hoping to base myself somewhere nearby, maybe rent a place in town." She paused, her voice becoming softer. Unless you think I'd be too much of a distraction from your renovation project. Marcus nearly dropped his coffee mug. He turned to meet her eyes, searching for any sign she was simply being polite. Instead, he found something that made his pulse quicken, hope mixed with vulnerability, as if she was taking the same emotional risk he'd been afraid to take. "The cabin's getting pretty livable," he said carefully. "Running water, electricity, even heat that works most of the time. But there's still a lot of work to do." "I'm good with my hands," Elena replied, a smile tugging at her lips. "My grandfather made sure I knew how to fix things. It gets lonely up here, especially in winter. I imagine it does." Marcus set down his mug and turned to face her fully. "Elena, I need you to understand something. When I came here, I was running from everything. My team, my failures, the guilt that was eating me alive. I thought isolation was the answer. And now? Now I realize I wasn't running from those things. I was running from the possibility of having something worth losing again." He reached for her hand, his calloused fingers intertwining with hers. "Being with you, fighting beside you, it reminded me who I used to be, who I could be again." Elena's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "I've spent my whole life in my grandfather's shadow, following paths other people laid out for me. But here, with you, I feel like I'm finally choosing my own direction." "It won't be easy," Marcus warned. "I still have bad days, nightmares. Sometimes I wake up not knowing where I am. I have my own ghosts," Elena replied. "Losing my parents, feeling responsible for my grandfather's death, always being afraid to trust my own instincts." She squeezed his hand. "Maybe we can help each other heal." Marcus leaned closer, his forehead touching hers. "The cabin could use a greenhouse, somewhere to grow things year-round. I'd like that. And maybe a proper workshop for research." "The foundation's already stronger than I thought it would be," Marcus murmured, his lips barely brushing hers. "Turns out it was built to last." "The best things usually are," Elena whispered back. Their kiss was gentle, tentative, full of promise rather than passion. It tasted like coffee and new beginnings, like the mountain air after a storm has cleared. When they finally pulled apart, Marcus looked out over the land that had become home. Not just the cabin he'd rebuilt board by board, but the entire mountain with its hidden valleys and ancient secrets. For the first time since arriving, he could envision a future here that included more than just solitude and survival. "So," he said, his arms settling around Elena's shoulders, "ready to help me finish what we started?" Elena leaned into his warmth, watching the sun climb higher over their mountain. "I thought you'd never ask." "How many?" Elena whispered, checking her rifle's magazine. Marcus peered around the corner, counting the tactical lights sweeping through the trees. 3 choppers, probably 6 men each, were outnumbered 4-1. "I've faced worse odds." She met his eyes and he saw no fear there, only cold determination. "The cave entrance is our only chance." The documents they'd recovered from the buried laboratory painted a picture more horrifying than either had imagined. Blackwater hadn't just been testing biological weapons on the mountain. They'd been preparing to deploy them in populated areas. Elena's father had died trying to stop them, and now his daughter was finishing what he'd started. A spotlight blazed across their position, forcing them deeper into the shadows. Marcus's military training kicked in, his mind automatically calculating angles, cover points, and escape routes. The cabin he'd spent months rebuilding was about to become a battlefield. There, Elena pointed to a narrow gap between 2 fallen logs. "We can reach the tree line without being seen." They moved in synchronized silence, years of combat experience guiding their steps. Behind them, the first wave of operatives rappelled from the helicopters, their boots hitting the ground with practiced precision. Marcus recognized their formation. These weren't ordinary mercenaries. They were elite soldiers, probably former special forces like himself. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd come to this mountain to escape violence, only to find himself in the middle of a war that had been brewing for decades. But this time felt different. This time, he wasn't fighting for orders or country or abstract ideals. He was fighting for Elena, for the truth, and for the chance at redemption he'd never thought possible. They reached the cave entrance just as the first shots rang out behind them. The operatives had discovered their trail. Elena produced a headlamp from her pack, its beam revealing the narrow tunnel that led deep into the mountain's heart. "The main chamber is half a mile in," she said, already moving forward. "There's another exit on the north face, but it's a technical climb." Marcus followed her into the darkness, the weight of his rifle comfortable in his hands. "I can handle technical. What I can't handle is leaving those documents behind. They're uploaded to 3 separate servers. If we don't make it out, we're making it out." His voice carried absolute conviction. "Both of us." The tunnel branched ahead, and Elena took the left fork without hesitation. Marcus realized she knew these caves better than she'd let on. This wasn't her first time running from Blackwater operatives through these passages. "How long have you been fighting this war?" he asked as they pressed deeper into the mountain. "Since I was 12 and watched them kill my father." Her voice echoed off the stone walls. He thought he could expose them through proper channels. He thought the system would protect whistleblowers. She laughed bitterly. "I learned better." Behind them, lights flickered in the tunnel entrance. Their pursuers had found the cave. Marcus paused, pulling a fragmentation grenade from his belt. He'd brought it as a last resort, but this qualified. "Keep moving," he told Elena. "I'll slow them down." "Marcus, no. That tunnel collapse could save our lives." He was already pulling the pin. "Trust me." She looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. As she disappeared around the next bend, Marcus rolled the grenade back toward the entrance and ran. The explosion shook the entire mountain, and chunks of rock crashed down behind them, sealing the tunnel. "That was either brilliant or insane," Elena said when he caught up to her. "Both." Marcus grinned despite their circumstances. "It's a SEAL thing." They emerged into a vast underground chamber lit by Elena's headlamp. Ancient rock formations created natural pillars and hiding spots throughout the space. But what caught Marcus's attention was the rope bolted to the far wall, their escape route. 60 feet of technical climbing in the dark, Elena said, following his gaze. "Think you're up for it?" Marcus tested the rope's tension. It was solid, professionally installed. "After you." As Elena began her ascent, Marcus heard something that made his blood run cold, voices echoing from another tunnel entrance. The operatives had found an alternate route. They had maybe 10 minutes before this chamber would be swarming with hostile forces. He started climbing, his muscles burning from the vertical ascent. Above him, Elena moved with spider-like grace, her silhouette disappearing into the darkness above. The rope swayed with their combined weight, but it held. Halfway up, Marcus heard the first operative enter the chamber below. A flashlight beam swept across the walls, searching. He pressed himself against the rock face and continued climbing, knowing that discovery now would mean certain death for both of them. The morning sun cast long shadows across the freshly turned earth where they had buried the remnants of Elena's father's research. Marcus stood at the kitchen window of his rebuilt cabin, watching Elena tend to the wildflower garden she had planted over the spot. 3 months had passed since the confrontation with Blackwater, and the mountain felt different now, cleaner somehow, as if the land itself had exhaled a breath it had been holding for decades. The cabin transformation was complete. What had once been a crumbling shell now stood as a testament to second chances. Hand-hewn beams supported a solid roof, large windows invited the mountain light inside, and the stone fireplace Marcus had rebuilt served as the heart of their new home. Every nail, every board, every carefully fitted stone had been placed with purpose, much like the pieces of his own fractured life. Elena emerged from the garden, dirt on her hands and a smile that still made his chest tight with gratitude. She had chosen to stay not just on the mountain, but with him. The choice hadn't been easy. She had a life to return to in Denver, a career as an environmental lawyer that could resume. But the mountain had claimed her too, in its own way. "The lupines are coming up beautifully," she said, settling beside him on the porch swing he had built. The wood was smooth under their hands, another small project that had become an act of hope. "I think your mountain approves of flowers over weapons-grade uranium." Marcus chuckled, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. The nightmares still came occasionally, but they were different now. Instead of being trapped in endless loops of violence and loss, he found himself dreaming of building things, rooms to add to the cabin, a workshop in the clearing, maybe even a small greenhouse for Elena's botanical pursuits. "Agent Torres called this morning," Elena said quietly. "The last of the Blackwater executives was sentenced yesterday. Conspiracy, environmental terrorism, multiple homicides. They won't see daylight for decades." Marcus nodded. Justice felt abstract after everything they had endured, but it mattered. The mountain's secrets were finally at rest, and those who had tried to exploit them faced consequences. More importantly, the land was protected now. Elena had used her legal expertise to ensure the entire area was designated as a protected watershed, making any future mining impossible. "I've been thinking," Elena continued, her voice carrying that tone that meant she had been planning something, "about what comes next." Marcus turned to study her face. They had fallen into a comfortable rhythm over the past months, rebuilding, healing, learning to trust the peace they had found. But Elena was right to think about the future. They couldn't stay suspended in this perfect bubble forever. "The Foundation wants to fund a research station," she said. "Here, on the mountain, to study the environmental impact of what happened, to monitor the restoration. They offered me the position to head it up." The Foundation, a coalition of environmental groups that had formed after the Blackwater revelations became public. Their story had made national news, though they had managed to keep many of the personal details private. Marcus felt a familiar tension in his shoulders, the old instinct to avoid attention, to remain invisible. "What did you tell them?" he asked. "That I needed to talk to my partner first." Elena's hand found his, fingers intertwining. "It would mean people coming here sometimes. Scientists, government inspectors, journalists. It would change things." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, watching a red-tailed hawk circle over the valley below. The old Marcus would have said no immediately, would have packed up and found another remote corner of the world to disappear into. But that Marcus had been running from something. This Marcus had found something worth staying for. "What kind of research station?" he asked. Elena's eyes lit up. "Small, sustainable, a place where people could come to study ecological restoration, to learn how damaged land can heal. We could build it ourselves, design it to be part of the landscape instead of imposed on it." The idea took shape in Marcus's mind like a blueprint. He could see it. A modest building tucked into the trees, solar panels catching the mountain sun, research equipment that monitored the soil and water they had fought so hard to protect. Another kind of building project. Another way to create something lasting and good. "We'd still have our privacy," Elena added quickly. "The cabin, our life here. But we could also be part of something bigger, something that honors what happened here." Marcus brought her hand to his lips, kissing her knuckles gently. The boy who had dreamed of building things would have understood immediately. The broken soldier was still learning to believe in dreams again. "Let's do it," he said simply. Elena's smile was radiant. "Really? Really? But I have one condition." "What's that?" "We build it together. Every beam, every window, every solar panel. If we're going to do this, we do it right."